Listen, we need to talk. We've been together for so many years. We've done so many amazing things. But recently, you've changed. You're not behaving like you used to. You're hiding things from me. And frankly, I don't know how long I can go on like this. Hello, Pi geeks and techno nerds all around the world. My name's Jeff, and I'm an IT professional who's been in the industry for over 30 years. I've been using Raspberry Pi since they first came out, and I wanted to share with you some of the projects that I've done over the years. If you like what you see on this channel, please hit that thumbs up button, subscribe if you want to see more, and hit that notification bell so you can be told when I put a new video out. And let me know in the comments how you get on with any project that I do. And if you've got any ideas for stuff for me to do in the future, put those in there as well. Now, despite my Oscar-worthy performance in the intro there, I'm not falling out of love with the Raspberry Pi really. They're amazing pieces of technology and I still love to use them. However, there are a few things that really do get on my nerves with them. And I just can't understand why these things haven't been sorted out. So let me go through with you just 3 things that really annoy me about the Raspberry Pi. Now, the first thing that I want to talk about is this, the Raspberry Pi 02W. Now, when this was released, it was certainly a worthy successor to the Pi Zero with a quad-core 64-bit CPU. However, one thing that was not upgraded was the memory on board. It was still stuck with a measly 512 megabytes of RAM, and this was severely limiting in terms of the projects that you could do with it. Now, I found with the project that I was trying to do to implement a slideshow, I was even struggling to run a simple database server and a website. Just the operating system takes up a whole load of memory. And it just leaves you with so little memory available for your applications. Now, I'm not the only one who's thinking this. Plenty of people have complained about exactly the same thing. And the Pi Foundation have basically been saying that they can't physically put more memory on the device purely because it would just get too expensive. However, I have a real problem with this. If we go back to the Pi Moroni website here, you can see that the basic Pi 02W costs £14.40 here in the UK. Now in itself, that's still really good value. I'm not knocking that so much. If I then compare that to the orange Pi 02W device, this has got exactly the same processor on it, exactly the same form factor, yet it's got 4 gigabytes of RAM on board. And it's only £4 more expensive. Now granted, this one would be coming from AliExpress, so there'd be another £3.50 put on for shipping. But even then, if you consider the overall cost to be £22 versus £14, yet you get 4 gigabytes of memory, it's a vastly more useful device. So when it comes to this, I'm just left making the assumption that the Pi Foundation have got some kind of limitation in the cost base for their hardware that maybe the Orange Pi people don't have. But it does get me thinking that if and when a Pi 03W is announced, that it will most likely feature a whole lot more memory than the current model. And in today's day and age, I really do believe that 2 gigabytes, maybe 4 gigabytes, is kind of the minimum that they should be providing for this kind of device. Because that's the kind of memory that you need in order to be able to run the operating system and even some fairly basic application software that could make use of that quad-core CPU. There's no point in giving us a powerful CPU if we don't have enough memory or storage capacity to be able to make use of it. Now in this case, storage isn't a problem. Fine, we've got the micro SD card there. But being limited like this with memory, it just makes no sense to me. Now the second thing I want to talk about here is kind of a continuation of my last video where I tried to use a WiFi6e USB dongle on a Raspberry Pi. And I had some success with this on a Raspberry Pi 4 that was running Raspberry Pi OS Bullseye. Now, one of the things that I wanted to take away from this was trying to get it to run on a Raspberry Pi 5. Now, as a stepping stone to that, what I initially wanted to do is get it running on a Raspberry Pi 4 running the Bookworm operating system, the latest version of the 64-bit OS. So let me show you where I got to with this. Here, I'm logged on to my Raspberry Pi 4. I've already installed Raspberry Pi OS Bookworm. I've also run sudo rpi update to bring in all of the latest firmware, installed rpi source, and downloaded and built the drivers for my USB Wi-Fi card in exactly the same way as I did in my last video. Now on Bookworm, it's already running WPA supplicant version 2.10, so I don't need to go through that upgrade. Now if I run the command ip-link show, as you see here, you can see that my WLAN1 device is showing up, and this is my USB Wi-Fi dongle. Similarly, if I run the iwregget command, then you can see here for my USB Wi-Fi device, the country has been set. And I achieved that in exactly the same way as my last video, where I had to create a modprobe option file containing that configuration. Now, if I run sudo iw dev wlan1 scan, and I pipe the output of that into grep 6G, I should just be returned any networks that it sees that have got 6G in the network name. And indeed there I can see my 6G network. However, right now I can't connect to it. Now if I run the command sudo nmcli con show, this shows me all of the network devices that are configured on my Raspberry Pi. And here you can see that my 6G network is one of them. But if I try to bring that network interface up with the command sudo nmcli con up and the name of my network, then you can see here that it doesn't work. And after doing a lot of digging, I did find out why. If I run the command sudo wpa _cli -i wlan1 to point it at my USB Wi-Fi dongle, dump, then pipe that into grep sae _pwe, you can see that the value of that is currently set to 0. Now this is a bit strange, because if I look at the configuration file for that network interface, you can see that I'm specifically setting the value of that to 1. And I suspect that this configuration file is actually being ignored on Bookworm. Now I can manually set this with the command sudo wpa _cli -i wlan1 set sae _pwe 1, and it comes back saying OK. And now if I try to bring the network connection up, this time it successfully connects. And if I try to look at the address of it with sudo ip add show wlan1, you can see I've got an IP address now for that network connection. So on my Pi 4, I've not got anything seamlessly working yet because I don't know how to change the value of the SAE _PWE parameter and make it persist. But now let's go and try to do exactly the same thing on a Raspberry Pi 5. So now I'm here on my Raspberry Pi 5, and fundamentally everything is identical to the Pi 4. It's the same version of Raspberry Pi OS Bookworm 64-bit. I've updated all of the firmware to the latest, and then I've been through the same process of downloading, building and configuring the drivers for my USB Wi-Fi adapter. So if I show the links that are available on my Pi 5, then just as before I do see my WLAN1 device. And similarly, if I look in Network Manager, I can see that my 6G network is configured there. And if I try to bring the connection up with sudo nmcli con up and then the name of my network, just as with the Pi 4, it can't find it right now. So I was thinking, oh, easy, it's just because of that parameter in WPA supplicant. So I thought, no problem, I can use the same command as I used on the Pi 4 to set the value of SAE _PWE to 1. And that said OK. But now if I try bringing the connection up, it still fails. And indeed, if I run the command that I did before to scan all of the wireless networks that WLAN1 can see, and then I try to find if any contain 6G, then for ages I'm getting these device or resource busy errors. But even when I can get in there and do the scan, it's not finding anything. So then if I try to force WPA supplicant to do a scan, when I look at the results of that scan, I still can't find my network. Now, I'm deliberately not showing you all of the rest of the results from the scan, just purely because it's showing all of my neighbours' network IDs, and I want to keep their private information secure. But it is just a thing here, that regardless of whether I try within WPA supplicant or I try within Network Manager itself, neither will show me any 6G network. Now, the other things I have checked are things like this, just to make sure that my country has been set successfully, and that all of the 6G frequencies that I would expect to be enabled for my country are available to the network card. Yet I can't see any 6G networks at all. So since I'm running the same operating system, both Pi4 and Pi5 have got the latest firmware applied. The drivers are identical because they both come from the same source code, and all of the configuration information on the box is identical. It works on the Pi4, but it doesn't work on the Pi5. And this just makes me think there has got to be something fundamentally set within the firmware for the Pi5 that is just not supporting 6G radio frequencies. Now, I don't know that for sure, but it's just infuriating that there's this difference in performance between the two versions of Raspberry Pi when they're otherwise seemingly configured in an identical fashion. Now, in a prior video, I was able to attach a PCI Express Wi-Fi 6 network card to the Raspberry Pi 5 through its PCI Express interface. And even though that wasn't exactly seamless, it did eventually work and I was able to see and connect to 6G networks. However, in this case, I can't use my USB Wi-Fi 6 network card at all. It just doesn't seem to work on the Pi 5. And I have absolutely no explanation for it. If anyone out there watching this does know, please let me know in the comments, because I'd love to know. But if there is something that's fundamentally disabled within the Raspberry Pi 5 firmware, I really do wish that the Raspberry Pi Foundation would actually make that information public, because it would save people like me an awful lot of time and effort if they knew that what they were trying to achieve just couldn't work right now. Now, I'm absolutely sure it will work eventually. It would be crazy for the Foundation not to allow the Raspberry Pi 5 to connect to Wi-Fi 6 networks. Now, equally, I had a comment from one of my viewers saying that they used a USB Wi-Fi 6 network card based on firmware made by MediaTek, as opposed to my one that's based on firmware made by Realtek. And he was saying that that worked okay. So right now, I'm just really confused. I don't know what does work and what doesn't work on a Pi 5, and equally, I've no idea why. And that's just really frustrating. The final issue that I've got with the Raspberry Pi that I want to talk about here is about hardware video encoding. Now, for me, this is a really important piece of functionality. I actually work with video all the time in my job, and so it's something that I really enjoy playing with. Now, in a prior video I made that was talking about how to use a Raspberry Pi 4 as an equivalent of a sling box, I showed there how I was able to make use of the Raspberry Pi 4's capability of using hardware video encoding to then encode a 720p HD signal and send it out over the network. Now, what's baffling is that in the Raspberry Pi 5, I can't do this. So let me show you what I mean by switching back to our Raspberry Pi 4 here and doing a quick experiment. Now, this command is super complicated, but what it's effectively trying to do is capture video frames at full HD, so that's 1080p 60 frames a second, and then it's just throwing those frames away. So effectively, all I'm trying to do here is just find out how quickly I can read in video frames. And what you can see here is that the Raspberry Pi is actually able to read the video signal pretty well. So what I'm going to do here is use the built-in software H.264 encoder to try to encode that video signal. And what you can see is that it's really struggling to do so. It can barely get above 10 frames a second. Even if I drop the incoming resolution to 1280 by 720 or 720p HD, then you can see here it can only get into the mid-20s. And indeed, if I switch to a window that's running HTOP on this box, you can see how heavily loaded the box is. The memory is almost entirely exhausted and the CPU is running pretty much flat out. The system's become quite unresponsive as well, quite hard to click around. So now let's switch over to try to use the built-in hardware encoder. Now the only difference here is in the codec that I'm using to encode the video. And this particular codec will direct the encoding onto the built-in hardware encoder that's built into the Raspberry Pi 4's GPU. And what you can see here from the frames per second counter and also from the speed is that it's much more able to keep up with that close to 60 frames a second that it can read in from the USB capture card. Also, if I switch to the HTOP report, you can see that the CPU isn't being touched anywhere near as hard. And so the box is still running and everything's running great. So on the Raspberry Pi 4, I can't work with 1080p video, but I can work with 720p video no problem. Now let's go and take a look on a Raspberry Pi 5. So if I run up the same command on my Pi 5 to capture the video signal and then just throw it away, you can see that it's kind of similar to the Raspberry Pi 4 in that it's well above 50 frames a second. So if I run up FFmpeg again here using the software H.264 encoder, if you look at the frames per second counter, it's pretty much just as bad as what the Raspberry Pi 4 was doing, getting about 20 frames a second, which is a slight improvement but not a lot. And if I switch over to HTOP, you can see the CPU is being hit just as hard as the Pi 4 was. So I'm getting nowhere near the 60 frames a second capture that I want to have. So if I now switch to 720p and I start trying to encode that using the H.264 software encoder, you can see here that it actually does a reasonable job and it's just under 50 frames a second. Although that's actually worse than what the Raspberry Pi 4 was doing. And if I switch to HTOP, you can see that the CPU is being driven way harder than the Pi 4 was. So in terms of the end result, the Pi 5 isn't actually performing as well as the Pi 4. And the really frustrating thing about this is that the GPU within the Raspberry Pi 5, which is the Broadcom Video Core 7 GPU, it does actually support H.264 hardware video encode. However, for some reason, the Raspberry Pi Foundation have never enabled this to be used from the Raspberry Pi OS. So I have no other option other than to use the software-based encoder. Now, as you saw in that example, the Pi 5 doesn't have enough CPU grunt to be able to consistently encode 1080p 60 frames a second video, even though there were some claims put out there from someone at the Pi Foundation that it could. And they used this as a justification for not enabling the hardware encoding. Now, as far as I can tell, all this would need would be a firmware change to enable the Raspberry Pi operating system to be able to direct the Video Core 7 GPU to use the H.264 hardware encoder. And yet it's never been enabled. And this is really restrictive in terms of a whole bunch of projects that I'd like to do with the Raspberry Pi. Now, in terms of the Jellyfin media software, that contains callouts to support various types of hardware encoding. But if you're running that on a Raspberry Pi 5, you don't get any option at all to do it. Equally, if I wanted to improve on the project I did to make the Raspberry Pi behave like a sling box and have it use 1080p video rather than 720p, again, I can't do it. And it really makes absolutely no sense to me. Now, I fully understand that when any new Raspberry Pi product is put out to market, maybe there's some stuff that is still being worked on, and so maybe not everything would be available at launch. But here we are pretty much a year after the Raspberry Pi 5 launch, and this is still disabled. And indeed, there's not even any word I can see about them even working on it. And so this is one that I find entirely baffling, where there's perfectly good hardware on the Raspberry Pi 5. It's very capable, has all of the facilities to be able to do hardware video encoding, but they just don't enable it. But I think it's about time that I got off my soapbox now. As I said before, I'm not falling out of love with the Raspberry Pi at all. There's just a few things that I do get a bit grumpy about. And I'm sure all of these things will be addressed in time. And maybe I'm just being impatient. But that's it for this video. Just like always, if you do like what you see here, please hit that thumbs up button. Subscribe if you want to see more, and hit that notification bell to be told when I put a new video out. Let me know in the comments if there's anything that you find frustrating about any model of Raspberry Pi. And also, if you do have any ideas for projects that you'd like to see me do, put those in there as well. Thanks so much for watching till the end, and until next time, bye for now.